just to start, I called the talk Wonder Woman, A History of the Female Superhero. And there we have a great iterative version of Linda Carter. Okay, so two quotations I'm going to start the discussion with. Um, so Marston, William Moulton Marston, who is Wonder Woman's creator, he's a psychologist, complicated figure, but really quite a visionary. Um, his works were, I mean, his purpose for creating Wonder Woman, as he said, is frankly Wonder Woman is psychological propaganda for the new type of woman who I believe should rule the world. Um, his work is fascinating. He's interested in what we now call today's social infrastructure. He builds a whole world of really fascinating just systems, constructs in infrastructure. The Holiday College, the Reform Island, which is a prison reform system, Paradise Island, and others. He's very interested in what kinds of institutions would help people to develop psychologically. So while he's saying his Wonder Woman comics are not only psychological propaganda for just the figure of Wonder Woman, but he also imagines an entire landscape of infrastructure that would allow for healthier development, healthier psychology, which is indebted to the mental hygiene movement of that era. And his works are fascinating. I think I say all of that to expand our understanding of Marston because I think too often he's seen sort of as a caricature of himself when people like to talk about his sort of his what what we understand as his sort of sexual fantasies, and I think too often he gets caricatured because he's actually quite fascinating. And his what he imagined comics and specifically Wonder Woman could do is really quite amazing. So I'll start with him. So I want to think about that, the psychological propaganda, quote propaganda not being like a negative in this case, but really just it was a way of organizing for him just social justice. Um, and then the second quotation, um, Gloria Steinem would reprint select Wonder Woman stories in 1972 when she also put Wonder Woman on the cover of Ms. Magazine. And she says, as a little girl, Wonder Woman was the only female superhero, so she was irresistible. She was literally the only game in town, the only hero that made you feel good about yourself. So while I take Steinem's point and I really love it, and I think Steinem has done, I mean, as I will talk about it when we get to the 70s, has done really important stuff for Wonder Woman. I share this quote at the beginning because it's fascinating when Steinem says that she was the only game in town. As I'll talk about, Woman was in fact not the only game in town. There were plenty, and the fact that Gloria Steinem in 1972 has sort of forgotten that is very telling of the history of these figures. Will notice, I think, one of the things that becomes quite clear often is that there is this sort of this way in which female superheroes in particular take over comics and then are pushed back down, and they take over comics again and they're pushed back down, and it becomes very clear in Steinem's quotation here that when she says that, but it leads us to an entree into this question, like, why did she forget? Why was there this forgetting? And why is there this continual forgetting and revival of female superheroes as if it's the first time? Like I said, this is less of a critique of her and more of a moment to ask, why did she forget? And why are these heroes forgotten? And as I want to talk about, I mean, we see comics for the last, at least for my lifetime, they've been fighting against this sort of boys club mentality, which is absolutely true after a certain period in comics history, namely the post 1950s comics up until really through the 2010s, like the early up to through 2010, were dominated by men, but that wasn't true the earlier years. And why that history gets forgotten is really important, and I think something that I want to talk about and hopefully we can think about together. And this is just one example of that sort of forgetting of the history that is there, that definitely gets erased. Okay, so I'll back up though. That's all for later. So the so superhero comics begin while comics emerge. While sequential art or comic strips emerge much earlier. Comic books even before this, the superhero begins really with the publication of Superman in 1938. Others will sort of debate who the first superhero is. For our sake, it's Superman in the sense that Superman would define a genre that would then get repeated. As Peter Coogan is a comic scholar that notes that, I mean, you created, like, a genre is created when there's repetition. So people will debate about, if this constitutes a superhero or not. The fact is that Superman was created, and then we get repetition. We get Batman, we get Wonder Woman, we get Green Lantern and the Flash, and I mean, there's countless superheroes that are created. So for our sake, it begins here. In her book, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, Jill Lepore says of Superman that he's indebted to the history of science fiction. The character of Batman is indebted to the history of detective fiction. Wonder Woman, notably though, is indebted. Her stories aren't indebted to in the same way to fiction. They're indebted to utopian fiction, is what she would say, like the work of Charlotte Perkins Gilman and others. But notably, she's indebted to a history of politics, which feminist utopian fiction was imagining. And it becomes really interesting when she says this, because it does lead us to wonder, okay, how then do female superheroes gain momentum and fade away as the politics shift, and less so with like a fictional narrative like detective fiction or science fiction doesn't fade, but you do have ups and downs, as we know, the waves of feminism, and you'll see the way that the female superhero in particular, their popularity, their representation, their presentation in the comics form will wax and wane as with these waves of feminism. And I won't do like exact years, but we will see that as that it is, as Wonder Woman is indebted to politics, you'll see as the characters that will come later, that will be her heirs, will also be indebted to that as well in many ways. So in these early comics, we see the characters. This is very common in these early comics that you have these heroes that were saving women, or usually women that were tied up. Of course, famously Billy Batson, Shazam. He will often be tied up and or gagged, so he can't say the word Shazam. But it's very common that you'll see these early female heroes, female characters being saved by men. Wonder Woman begins to challenge that narrative with her creation in 1941, when Marston and H.G. Peter create the character. She's often tied up, but often seen breaking those chains, breaking the ropes, breaking whatever it is that has tied her up. And it's an impressive moment, because here she is taking control of the situation and breaking whatever ties that bind her. And you have this over and over again. And it's a really lovely moment in the comics, because you have her just taking over and sorry, one of the cats is just distracting me. As I said, there's 3 of them. They will come in and out. You will have her break her own chains. And Marston gave us this imagery. He says she's feminist propaganda. And one of the things he does is he shows us the images that we know of these women being tied up, as I showed you earlier. And this is a common trope. I remember watching Bugs Bunny cartoons where you would see, like, either he would be dressed up as a female rabbit, or you'd see a female rabbit tied up. It's not uncommon in cartoons, especially. So Marston, though, was interested in, as he says, propaganda. So he would tie Wonder Woman up in order to break chains, in order to show her breaking out of these restraints. He imagined Wonder Woman as president. He says at one point that he believes that in 100 years, from 1941, in 100 years, that there will be a female president. In the comic, it's 1,000 years, but he does say in his writings that he believes that in 100 years there will be a female president, and that's what he's pushing for in his comics. As I said, sort of what he imagines the world to look like in his comics, or the potential for what the world can look like, is fascinating. And he's not even asking, he often on this story set in the future, but in many of the comics, he's not even interested in um, far off futures, but he imagines at this moment that we could achieve more. He and I, without getting more in depth with him, like he does, he's very critical of what he calls futuritis. He writes about this in a book called Try Living, where he says like he doesn't want to put everything off into the future. He imagines that things can change now. And he often will, that will be sort of a model for many of his superhero stories, except for this one. Um, but so at the core of the stories, um, the thing that drives Diana, Wonder Woman, which is so important, and it's unique to her story until there's only a few other characters that I will discuss, but what's unique to her story is the fact that she is born of her mother's love, and this is not a radical idea, though you might think it is, because so many writers that have taken one over Wonder Woman comics have attempted to undermine this idea. From Robert Kanigher, who took over from Marston after Marston passed away, to Brian Azzarello, who would write later in the 2000s. This and others as well. This narrative of Wonder Woman being born from clay at the hand at you know at the hands of her mother is so has been so challenged by many writers, which is quite sad. And so we see here, I guess here's Wonder Woman um, coming to life after Hippolyta has made her from clay, and Aphrodite blesses her, and she does come to life. She gives Hippolyta a daughter, but it's such an important moment, and yet it's something that gets erased. Um, Again, in these early Wonder Woman comics, which I highly recommend reading, I'll move on from Wonder Woman shortly, but I always just try to just rescue, or not rescue, but sort of just promote these early stories. The mother-infant dyad is so, I say that as a clinician, the mother-infant relationship is um, is so significant to these early comics. You'll see that representation of the mother and child together so often in the early comics of that H.G. Peter drew and Marston wrote, and they make that central to these stories. And it's a psychology, it's a psychology of, it's an interpersonal psychology that they really push for, that you won't see in comics for a long time. They were so far ahead in their understanding of that dynamic. But so this is all within these early Wonder Woman comics, and she inspires a slew of other heroes. Though I will note, while Wonder Woman is by far the most popular and recognizable female hero, she's not the first, as I will talk about in a second. Uh, um, and here's just an image that I like that I'll come back to, in particular this, if you pay attention. Wonder Woman is clearly, she's an action heroine. I say that importantly because after the war, it will be the rise of romantic heroines. But she's clearly an action heroine, responding to the responding to the Second World War, and she can do everything. She's saving Steve Trevor's life. She's a nurse. She's a scientist. She's a great warrior. She can do all kinds of things. And what's amazing is she's not um, she's not superhuman in the way that we think of like other characters being superhuman. She's Mars, especially in these early issues. Later on, writers will change the story and she'll be superhuman. But for Marston, it's not that she is superhuman, it's that she was exceptionally well trained. And that's an important point too for Marston's story, is that if we have the psychological supports and we have the training, that we can achieve what Wonder Woman can achieve. Obviously, it's a little bit of a stretch, but the push of Marston is just so, he's so optimistic for what can be achieved if we have psychological wellness, and if we allow for if we support one another. Okay, so but as I was saying, while Wonder Woman is clearly the most popular, she's not the first. That would be there's two, Miss Fury by Tarpe Mills and another character named the Cat. And during this period, during the 1940s, there were tons of female superheroes. The Blonde Phantom, here's Miss Fury, who would be the first. female superhero. Um, other female superheroes would be front and center in comics like the Black Canary, EC Comics, Entertaining Comics. They created Moon Girl, sort of their response to Wonder Woman, Miss America, another comic that was extremely popular. There were so many during the war era, that there was plenty of female superheroes that were selling very well. They were very popular, and then, I mean, there's tons more that I'm not even showing here. I just want to give you an idea, and this was all during that period after Wonder Woman was created until about 19 through the 1940s. But really, it started to wane by 1946, 1947. But I share that because, as I said earlier with Steinem's quotation, she says that Wonder Woman was the only game in town, which is not, which, as I said, is not is in fact not true. But the fact that these other heroes were so forgotten is something to think about. Why is it that these heroes were buried? They were dominating the stands, and then all of a sudden they're forgotten. So we have characters like, as I said, the Blonde Phantom, Miss America, Moon Girl, Miss Fury, and so many others. And then as the war ends, by 1947, you get the first romance comic, and romance and horror will take over comics, and romance will especially take over superhero comics, especially with the female superheroes. And this becomes really clear with Wonder Woman. After the war, you see, this is a sad image. All of a sudden now, Wonder Woman has shifted from more of an action heroine to a romantic heroine. So in the image before, as I showed you from the first issue of Sensation Comics, Wonder Woman was holding Steve Trevor. After the war, now he's holding her, and you see romance in the title. And whereas previous issues of Wonder Woman would have seen her using her just bouncing bullets off of her bracelets, as I showed you, as we saw with Sensation Comics #1, which I'll go back to really quick. Here's the first issue of Sensation Comics. She's clearly active. She's using her bracelets, and here we have her now. All of a sudden, she's this sort of romantic damsel, and it absolutely reflects what happens after the war. I mean, the comics, as I said, if these heroes, these female heroes in particular, represent what happens, are absolutely responding immediately to the culture at the time. This is super interesting and important in the sense too that that comics in particular are connected to whatever's happening at any given moment because of their publications, the publication style. They're produced quickly, right? They're produced, once a month, sometimes maybe every other month with a certain series, but typically they're produced once a month. So they respond very fast to changes in culture. When you have a film, sometimes, from production to playing in movie theater could be, 2 years. With comics, from the start of the production to print, 6 weeks. We're talking about a huge difference. They often will respond immediately to whatever's happening in the culture. Like I said, film sometimes, the only thing that I know that would respond as quickly is perhaps soap operas, but they have their own format. But comics often respond immediately to whatever's going on in the culture at the time, and so the shift was pretty fast as after the war, the push for women to go back to the home after the Rosie the Riveter era, and it was reflected in the birth of romance comics, especially in 1947, and the way that it took over these heroes' lives. And so around the same time, the same time after the war, you see characters now, the previous action heroines that would take over would turn into not yet entirely romantic heroines. We'll get to that, but you could definitely see the shift. Now you're having more sort of goal-oriented working characters, working women characters, Tessie the typist, Nellie the nurse. Though, it's not the same to have Nellie the nurse here, like, on the beach as it was to have Wonder Woman, bouncing bullets off of her bracelet. Millie the model, but still, like there's still some active presentation of these characters. I mean, she has shorts on. But you're starting to see the shift after the war. And it's most clear with Wonder Woman, who becomes a romantic heroine. So I'm gonna shift though for a second. So you see these stories happening. The stories are changing. A lot of the comics are starting to be canceled. That's a function of many different things. One, superheroes popularity, like we think of superhero comics as so popular right now, and they were incredibly popular during the Second World War, but their popularity waned as the Second World War started to end. Hold on, I need to plug in my computer. I forgot to do this. So their popularity started to wane. So it's not just that these characters are being forgotten or erased, but that the popularity of the superhero in general is starting to fade. And so you have new characters being born. But what will really put like the death knell in this history for these female superheroes is what happens in 1954 with the publication of a book called Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wortham, who was a psychiatrist. His book he was not the most important person during this period of what we call the anti-comics crusades, but he is to this day perhaps the most remembered, and he's sort of like a boogeyman for comics history. But starting in 1941, soon after and probably even before, but 1941 is one of the first articles that is recognized. There were scholars, some librarians, though Carol Tilley, who is a librarian at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, has proven that many librarians were in support of comics, but there were teachers, mental health practitioners, librarians, parents, and others that were critical of comics in the same way that people have been very critical of video games and other forms. And we don't have to get into that, but there was what was called the anti-comics crusades, and this led to attempts to ban comics in certain cities and states. It led to the burning of comics. And in 1954, it led to a Senate subcommittee hearing on comics, where Frederick Wortham testified that comics were not good for children, and based upon his work at the Lafargue Clinic in Harlem. He's a complicated figure, which I won't get into right now, but I mean, if you're interested in reading more about him, I'm happy to direct you to other works at the end. He's a very complicated figure. He was the first psychiatrist to create a psychiatric clinic dedicated to the mental health of African Americans in the United States in Harlem in 1946. And he would start writing about comics in 1948, but he would open up the clinic in 1946. He was, as others have said, I mean, his work was integral in Brown versus Board of Education, and he was an incredibly important psychiatrist, and perhaps would be remembered today as one of the most important American psychiatrists, outside of the fact that he went and he attacked comics and hoped to censor them. And so he went so far as this Senate subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency, focusing on comics for him. And so it's an important part of the history, because what would happen after this particular hearing, because it was such a big deal, that what happened was the comics companies came together and created a group called the Comics Code Authority. And the Comics Code Authority had certain regulations that would define like what could be told in what kind of stories would be told in comics. And what this led to, though, was a lot of companies namely the biggest one being EC Comics went under, but a lot of comics, just the sales went down greatly after this. They were heavily regulated, and there was a certain there was this the comics were now seen as not entirely bad, but I mean they weren't seen as good. And I won't blame it entirely on this moment in 1954. Of course, there were other elements of things that were happening, including the rise of television. I mean, comics were just never going to be as popular ever again after the rise of television, right? I mean, in 1940, in 1938, with the publication of Superman, there was no television. By 1954, there were starting to be TVs in houses, and so of course, comics would never reach the same popularity that they had in 1938, where Superman was selling, by 1940 was selling like a million copies a month. So I don't want to entirely blame this, but this did lead to a lot of changes in the comics companies. It led to a lot of people losing their jobs and led to a lot of companies that closed, and it led to the end of most of any female superheroes were one of the first to go after this, and their popularity was waning already. But by 1955, as Trina Robbins tells us, um, Wonder Woman was the only female superhero to lead her own book, whereas there had been so many that were leading their own stories in the 1940s. By 1955, Wonder Woman was the only one. And so, why we remember her and why we recognize her and why we know that and one of the reasons she retains popularity is simply because, no, I mean, other than the fact that she's a lovely character and I adore the character, but simply because she kept on being published. She she stayed. Um, it reminds me, I can't remember the exact quotation, but a few years ago, it was a really interesting moment. A few years ago, um, Madonna was given an award at I think it was like maybe an MTV Music Award or something like that. I don't remember what the award was exactly, but she states, she's like, the most controversial thing I ever did was stick around. And so in some ways that's the character of Wonder Woman. She stuck around, and she's been continuously published except for like I think like 4 months in 1985. That her series has been continuously published. But Wortham's book and the Senate subcommittee hearings mark a particular moment in time where you had the establishment of a comics code authority, where now comics were going to be self-regulated by the comics companies, and it was sort of the end of that early era. Um, and so that that will then signify a whole new world for comics. And as I said, Wonder Woman will be the only female superhero leading her own series after 1955. And when heroes do come back, when female superheroes do start to come back into the picture, as again, I'll quote Trina Robbins, who has a great book called The Great Women Superheroes. It's from she does amazing work uncovering the stories of women writers and women and this history of female superheroes. She has a great book called Pretty in Ink about female cartoonists from like 1896 to 2013. The Great Women Superheroes is another great book. I would totally recommend that. But so she does say that when female superheroes do start to appear again, namely with the Invisible Woman in Fantastic Four in 1961, she says they will literally be invisible. And so it is just a fact. It's a fact that these characters' stories were forgotten. They were mostly erased from comics. Okay, so I'll continue on though. So a lot happened after the establishment of the Comics Code Authority, namely in 1956. One of the things that DC Comics ends up doing, because of what was said in Wortham's book, he's very against the Batman and Robin story. He makes claims that Batman and Robin are in a pedophilic relationship. It's not true, but Wortham claims this. It's absurd. Anyway, I won't get into that very much of the fact that this leads DC Comics to creating the character of Batwoman in 1956. They need to make sure that Batman is seen as a father figure only to Robin. And here you'll see the way that the visuals are constructed. Here you have Robin looking at Batman, totally fine, because it's a young boy looking up to an older man. Here, Batman is looking only at Batwoman. Um, though a character like Batwoman, you can see by the end, by this is page 12 of the story, Batwoman is no longer a superhero by the end of her story. And the narrator says, and later a new trophy is added to the Batcave. And Batman says, at the end of this story, yes, she gave me the portrait now that her career is over. I thought it would be an interesting trophy. I wonder if we'll ever fight crime with her as the dynamic trio. So it's very clear in these early stories. Well, it's very clear in this story. I mean, one of the responses to them was, which for DC was to create a hero simply there to be an object for Batman. And this was how a lot of female heroes, I think, were treated, especially after that era where female superheroes really dominated. They were often objects. Um, it would take a long time, for example, like as I said, Trina Robbins notes of the Invisible Woman. I mean, it'd take many years for the Invisible Woman to become one of the powerhouse characters of the Fantastic Four. It would take John Byrne coming in the 1980s to show that, this is a character who has great possibility. And they're not just, not that she turns invisible, is that she creates sort of structures around her that would allow her to become invisible, so that, like, force fields. And so he says that she creates these force fields to make herself invisible, and they turn that defensive structure, the defensive superpower, into an active one. But that would take many years, and this period after the Wortham hearings, after the Senate subcommittee hearings that Wortham presented at, was a really low point for this history. And so just around the same time, you see here, approved by the Comics Code Authority, you'll see this is a very different Nellie the nurse. Millie the model has changed. And this would continue, these sort of not very powered, more romantic, even glamorous heroines, totally representing a different style, would continue. And by 1968, everything that Marston had done in those early years was completely erased from the comics, I would say. And by 1968, Denny O'Neil takes over the Wonder Woman comics, and this is it's called the white suit era of Wonder Woman, and she loses her powers in 1968, and she no longer has Paradise Island, she no longer has the lasso, she no longer has the invisible jet. All that's sort of taken away, and she sort of learns some type of fighting style. And it's sort of, I find it sort of a depressing era, though Denny O'Neil says that he was trying to think of it as a more feminist thing, like saying, like, oh, she doesn't need these superpowers. She doesn't need Paradise Island. She doesn't need all of that. Though I would argue, I mean, Marston wasn't interested in making her a superpowered figure, like having her, like, have beams come out of her. What he was interested in was having psychological and support from others, and physical training that would allow her to become better than any human being. But anyway, so by 1968, she's been worn down. You have like I just said, Trina Robbins will note of, like, the Invisible Woman. Wonder Woman has no powers. And so into the 1960s, this is the, after 1954 to the early 1970s, it's really a low point. But we have an uptick, a good trend. 1972, Gloria Steinem puts Wonder Woman on the cover of Miss Magazine. And she puts her back into her golden age costume. She gives her lasso. And famously, the story goes, as Steinem tells the story, she called up DC Comics. She called the editors at DC Comics, and because she wanted to put Wonder Woman on the cover, and she thought, I can't put a depowered superheroine on the cover of my magazine. So famously, she says, that she called up DC Comics, and the editors finally called her back, and they, like, exasperated, said, fine, we've given her back her powers, we've given her invisible jet, we've given her lasso, we're even going to introduce an African-American sister for her. Will you please leave us alone? This is how she tells the story. And so it is the fact that after 1972, Wonder Woman does get her powers back. I like this image. It's just a 40th anniversary cover. This year would actually be the 50th anniversary of that cover. But here, here's the first issue where Wonder Woman actually gets her powers back, and we are introduced to her sister Nubia, and here's an image of Gloria Steinem with Dorothy Hughes. I don't. It's not clear that Nubia was based entirely on Dorothy Hughes, but it is notable. Gloria Steinem is advocating for this, and she's obviously, what's important is, I mean, with her feminism she's also advocating for racial justice, and so she did advocate for that with DC Comics, and as she says, the story goes, they said, fine, we'll give you all this, we'll even give her a sister, please just leave us alone. But they did give her her powers back, which is notable. Again, if we go back to Marston, we think about the psychological propaganda, as he says. You want this heroine to offer a vision of power, not one of being depowered and losing everything. Notably, I say that because every superhero has a trauma narrative. Wonder Woman didn't have a trauma narrative, meaning that her origin didn't begin in trauma. Her origin began in sort of having everything, having all the support, having lived on Paradise Island, and her powers came not from a lack, from something that went wrong, but from having support and having the love of her mother. And to take that away undermines the entire story and the meaning of what her character can be for so many. And so I only share that because I do think it's important. It's not to say that we can't have a character that learns certain self-defense styles and uses that, but just that the vision of the character was her coming from having all of this greatness imbued in her, not by some coming from an alien planet, but being on Earth and having the support on Paradise Island and the love of her mother, and that allowed her to become powerful. All right. So 1972 also saw a change in comics. In 1972, let me back up. 1970. So in 1970, Trina Robbins publishes, with others, It Ain't Me, Babe. It's an anthology of stories about female characters, including Wonder Woman on the cover. She then publishes a series with others, with the Women's Comics Collective. They publish a series called Women's Comics. So this is sort of the underground era. So on the mainstream, you have Wonder Woman getting her powers back. And in the underground self-publishing world, Trina Robbins is creating It Ain't Me, Babe. And in 1972, the Women's Comics Collective published Women's Comics, an anthology series of autobiographical tales. And in the mainstream also, we do get the birth of new females, of for the first time in a long time, new female characters getting their own books. Supergirl in 1972, Night Nurse, The Cat, Shauna the She-Devil. This is all 1972. Fortunately, most of these series won't last very long. Supergirl will last for 10 issues. Night Nurse lasts for 4 issues. The Cat, I think, is 4 issues, and Shauna the She-Devil is 5. Not many issues, but you see the beginning of something happening. Like I said, it doesn't last very long, but it'll take a few more years, but then we'll start up again. But this is sort of what happens in this history. Is there's a lot of start and stop. Then, the mid 70s, we do get Linda Carter, which will inspire a new moment in comics. Her series ends in 1977. And in 1977, Marvel decides to try again with female superheroes, and they published Miss Marvel. Carol Danvers, who's now Captain Marvel, if you've seen the Captain Marvel movie, this is where her story began. She was Miss Marvel, then became Captain Marvel, and in this series, she runs a magazine called Woman Magazine. She's obviously a Gloria Steinem figure. So 1977, we get Miss Marvel. 1978, we get Spider-Woman. 1980, we get She-Hulk. 1981, we get Dazzler. 1982, we get a new Supergirl series. Um, and so there's a short period between 1978 and 1983 where there are several books uh, with female characters that are being published, which is a big deal. Like all of a sudden going from 1955 or where Wonder Woman is the only one. Now we have a handful, not not great considering how many superhero comics are out there, but we're starting to see something happen. Unfortunately, like I said, there will be this history of start and stop, and so um, in a lot of these series would then end. Miss Marvel would end soon after, but after 23 issues. Spider Woman after 50. She Hulk after 25 issues. They last a little bit longer. Dazzler after 42, I think. Supergirl after 23. Um, and then there's sort of a backlash. Um, Ms. Marvel's her series ends and she joins the Avengers. And her story begins with a horrible story, and I won't go into the details of it, but where she's brought into the Avengers soon after her series ends. Her son comes from the future to impregnate her. It's very disturbing, but there's sort of like these series are ended, and all of a sudden, and not only do they just end, but a lot of these characters become punished or are punished. As I'll talk about, there's a trend that happens, and um, you have Miss Marvel's terrible story. Spider Woman's story ends with her being erased from existence. Um, the weirdness of this is that like when other superhero stories end, they just end. There has to be, but there's with these characters like Spider Woman has to be completely erased from the Marvel universe. It's absurd. She has nobody remembers who she was. Again, it's sort of representative of that feeling that Steinem said, like Wonder Woman was the only game in town, which isn't true, but these characters exist and then they sort of get erased. That's very clear with like the Spider Woman comic. It's part of a trend though that Gail Simone had identified in the 90s, which she calls women in refrigerators, is that there's a trend in superhero comics in particular where female superheroes are often, as she said, assaulted, depowered, killed. It's not just that they can, ride off into the distance like the cowboy, right? That their story's over, they ride off into the distance, but they have to be depowered, assaulted, killed. And she takes this term from a Green Lantern comic where his girlfriend is literally killed and put into a refrigerator. And it's called Women in Refrigerators. It's now shortened to fridging. It's called just fridging, and it's often when a female character is killed in order to advance the plot. It happens in the second Deadpool movie. It happens in Avengers Endgame with Black Widow. It's not an uncommon trope that still dominates, but in particular, Gail Simone noticed it in the 90s, and she has just this list of all of these characters who were, as I said, depowered, assaulted, killed, as the end, sort of like in their stories, and there was no need for it. Another story could have been written. But this fridging is a common technique. It happened in the new Spider-Woman movie, a Spider-Man movie too. So those series end, and then female superheroes again sort of become popular in the 90s. But the trend in the 90s was a lot of like bad girl comics, as they're called. So you have these really like absurdly drawn heroes. Silver Sable. I mean, Wonder Woman's waist becomes non-existent. And then when we think of like bad sexist, over-sexualized superhero comics, I think of the 90s. I remember, I mean, when anybody talks about comics in the 90s, we all sort of like nod our head like, yeah, it was bad. There are some good stories in the 90s, but I mean that when we think of like just too many muscles and over-sexualization and just more of everything, it was comics in the 90s. And then what happens though, where things start to get sort of interesting again, we're ending the 90s, and I share this particular comic because they try again, Marvel tries again with a new Spider-Woman series. And at this point, there's been several Spider-Woman characters. There's Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, who I showed you earlier. She had her own series. This is the second Spider-Woman. She had a mini series. This is a character created for that story. Madam Web is right here. and others. This character is created for the story, and John Byrne writes this Spider-Woman story, and notably when she's created, Maddie Franklin is her name. When she's created, she takes on the colors of Spider-Man, and she doesn't take on the colors of one of the previous Spider-Women. And the other Spider-Women are depowered, or mostly, I mean, Jessica Drew becomes at one point is sort of just disabled, even though she hadn't been before. And what's sad in with this story is that she makes it very clear in the comic that she identifies with Spider-Man, and it's becomes very clear in the story that they're pushing this narrative of identification with a male figure, even though there's a history. So again, like there, you have a history of these characters, you have these previous Spider Women, and yet there's also like an active denial of this history, while you also acknowledge that it exists. And that in particular, I want to come back to, but just to give you a sense of what's happening in the 2000s, there will be many examples of here stories that do well. They start and stop. Birds of Prey, Mystique, who's a villain in the X-Men, has her own series. Spider-Girl is probably one of the most successful female superhero comics of all time. It lasted for 100 issues, namely because it was written by Tom DeFalco, who was one of the most famous Spider-Man writers. Other series will try and start. Aranya lasted probably 6 issues, I think. Spider-Woman gets a new series later in the 2000s, last 7 issues. By 2011, Marvel's only publishing one book led by a female hero. We're back to practically 1955. But then something does happen. I realize we are at 9 o'clock, so I'm going to skip over that really quick. And I'll start to try and wrap things up though. I'm going to keep talking. What happens that's sort of interesting is that in the 2000s, well, 2012 namely, Kelly sued. Well, I'll go back along. It'll help if I talk about this. So I realize we're running out of time soon, and we still have half an hour. But I realize that I want to leave some time for questions. But I'll talk a little bit longer, and then we'll do some questions. But I was talking about the 2000s, and what happens in 2006 is the beginning of what I think really becomes really interesting for what's happening now. In 2006, DC Comics, with the help of Greg Rucka, introduces a new Batwoman. And if you remember in 1956, I showed you the Batwoman character that was created sort of as a response to Frederick Wortham's claims. In 2006, on DC Comics, with the help of Greg Rucka, they introduce a new character, Batwoman, and her name is Kate Kane. The original character's name was Catherine Kane. This is Kate Kane. She's an out lesbian superhero. She wears a wig. She can take off the wig, and it's like a great scene where she takes off the wig, and she sort of shifts the narrative of the female hero. I think in many ways. I mean, she's looking at you in the early Batwoman figure. Batman's looking at her. Here she is coming at you. One of like the opening pages sometimes will be of her just like kicking, like you just see her boot. They try to change. With the help, Greg Rucka writes and J.H. Williams III draws it, and there's a shift in perspective on how we look at these heroes. I mean, the comic definitely shifts like the way that we look at characters. Not only do they change sort of the character's sexuality to respond to that moment 50 years earlier, but they also try to change how we look at these figures. And so, and here's an example of an image that's very clear of that. She, rather than you look at her, she sort of directs you across the page. So I say all that because we do start to see in 2012 namely, so that was 2006, but by 2012 we're starting to see like a revision of female heroes. This costume is absurd, right? I mean, like looking at some of these old costumes, like I can't even imagine that anybody thought this was a good idea. It's so funny. I mean, like and these kinds of costumes where they're basically bathing suits or midriffs they're just classic costumes for superhero comics, which are absurd. In 2012, I lost an image that I wanted. It'll come up anyway. I think I forgot one image that I wanted to show. What becomes really interesting in around the 2010s is that there's a they redo Miss Marvel's costume. She becomes Captain Marvel, and it creates a sort of moment. Here she is sort of redesigned. Now she has a full body costume. I was going to show you. I know it comes later, but I wanted to put it there too. She has a full body costume, much like Batwoman. But what becomes really interesting is so as Carol Danvers goes from Miss Marvel to Captain Marvel, a new Miss Marvel character is introduced, and her name is Kamala Khan. And her whole story is that she was inspired by Miss Marvel. She wants to, I mean, Captain Marvel, sorry. She wants to be Captain Marvel. She takes on the mantle of Miss Marvel. And this is a significant moment in comics history, especially with female superheroes, that here you have a female character identifying with another female character, wanting to be her and taking inspiration from her. And also not coming from trauma, like Wonder Woman. There are so few of these characters that actually come from not a history of trauma, but a history of plenitude. She has great parents. She has troubles, of course. I mean, she's a hero who has to have troubles, as they all do. But she doesn't come from her parents dying or losing her home planet or something like that. She comes from a pretty good life. She's struggling to figure out her life in the U.S., being a child of immigrants, but she identifies with this female character. It's a really important moment because historically we have a lot of male superheroes, kids usually, who you have a lot of male to male identification. There's so many Flashes and Green Lanterns and all that, and I mean there's so many Robins that identify with Batman that then become Nightwing and other characters. You have a lot of female to male identification, Batgirl to Batman, Hawkeye to the other Hawkeye. This is a unique moment where you have a female character that identifies with another female character that in turn then will bring that history to the forefront in comics. Unlike the Spider-Woman character who says oh, I identify with Spider-Man, and sort of erases that history. There's sort of this erasure outside of history, outside in our world of the history, and also within the comics. I didn't say this when we were talking about Spider-Woman, but what becomes really interesting is in 1983, Anne Nesenti, who would write not Batman, I'm sorry, she would write Daredevil and other comics. She's introduced in the letters pages of Spider-Woman issue 46, and they introduce her and they say, this is the first, she'll write issue 47 through issue 50 of Spider-Woman, and the writer will say this is amazing, this is the first time, the editor will say, this is the first time we have a female writer writing a female superhero, which is not true at all, because in 1972, as I was showing you, there's other series like The Cat, they were written by female writers, but there seems to be this constant just erasure. And so what's amazing here, when you have this Miss Marvel identifying with Captain Marvel and sort of bringing her to the forefront and telling us about her story and not denying that history, you do have a new moment where the female superhero is recognized as having a history and having a future. And here's a lovely moment where you see the Captain Marvel costume and Miss Marvel is hugging her. And you see it's a moment of power with Captain Marvel, it's a moment of love. I mean, it really invokes a lot of that early history of Wonder Woman, who is really the only other example of a hero whose story is not drawn from trauma, whose story is not a denial of history. Wonder Woman is obviously an Amazon. It's appealing to a history of female power of the Amazons. And you have that again with Miss Marvel. And it was a trend, whether it's starting with Miss Marvel or if it's a larger trend in comics that we noticed at the time. Genevieve Valentine comes on to join the Catwoman series soon after the Miss Marvel series begins. And Valentine writes the story of Catwoman taking over as a mob boss, which is sort of funny that she becomes a mob boss. But what's interesting is that in those pages, in every issue, she will talk about the letters of many female figures from history, namely one of them being Queen Elizabeth. And Catwoman you'll see quotations on manuscript that she's reading of like of Queen Elizabeth and other figures from female history like Joan of Arc, there whether consciously or unconsciously, I mean that like whether she was responding directly to something that was happening in those other comics or whether it was sort of a general trend, there was an uncovering of female history and an important um, just recognition of it, especially in this comic. And Catwoman will say, "If Elizabeth could raise a country, I can raise a city." And so you start to see this trend in these comics and of more female superheroes, but not only just more, but also connection to history and to one another, which makes it so much more powerful as they end up staying this time. Now, for the like 2012 and on, there's continuously series that are published, led by female characters, written by female writers that are incredibly popular. Like the Miss Marvel series at one time, I don't know what the numbers are now because digital numbers are not so easy to find. But at one point, the Miss Marvel series was the most popular digital comic series being published. Like these are, and it was written by G. Willow Wilson. She no longer writes the series, so I don't know where the numbers are right now. But when she was writing it, it was the most popular digital comic series, and this is pretty amazing. And so, as I was saying, there's lots of these stories being told. Um, what if you're wondering, Wonder Woman's story will be fixed. She will no longer, she will get her Paradise Island back again. I think I mentioned to you, I didn't say, I think I mentioned at the beginning that I said, Robert Kanigher will take away her, the fact that she was born from her mother's love. And after Marston dies, he writes Wonder Woman. She gets that story back, but then in the early 2000s, Brian Azzarello begins telling her story, and he reveals that Wonder Woman is born of Hippolyta and Zeus, which is such a silly story. And Greg Rucka rewrites that story in around 2015. He rewrites the story and gives Wonder Woman her real history back, that she was born of her mother's love on Paradise Island. So we correct that misogynistic narrative. And then there's just like a flourishing of superheroes, of female superheroes. Marvel really does a big push. DC does as well. Dynamite, Boom, all these major comics companies. And even now, you'll see like many of many of the superhero stories that are coming out like on Disney Plus, um, are led by female characters. The Scarlet Witch show, WandaVision, um, the She-Hulk series that's coming out, the Hawkeye series, the Miss Marvel series, Captain Marvel, Black Widow, those movies, and many more that are coming out. But after 2012, with the success of Captain Marvel and then Miss Marvel, soon after, with Kelly Sue DeConnick did Captain Marvel, and G. Willow Wilson wrote Miss Marvel. With the success of those stories, you get tons of female superheroes. She-Hulk, Elektra. There's the Captain Marvel. There's the full suit. Storm gets her own series. There's Miss Marvel again. Spider-Woman gets a new series, and she's had several series since. Silk. This character named Spider-Gwen, who becomes Ghost Spider. A character named Angela. Squirrel Girl. There'd be a female Thor is introduced. Black Widow. Princess Leia gets a comic. And then even now, I mean, there's plenty more. I mean, Jessica Jones, Shuri from the Black Panther. Alters is a series by Aftershock, which is they're looking at this hero. She's a trans hero, and super interesting series. Dr. Aphra, you get Star Wars series that led by female characters. The Unstoppable Wasp is an amazing series. If I recommend anything, I love this series by Jeremy Whitley. It's a great series about a character he does a great job of exploring this superhero who has bipolar disorder. It's an amazing series, and she has a group of female scientists that she works with, and they are sort of like a ad hoc superhero team. But it's a great series. I can talk about it more. I know I'm way over what time I wanted to stop, and so for questions. But so I totally recommend this. Mockingbird is a great series. She's by Chelsea Kane. Asked me about my feminist agenda. Naomi, another one, like I was saying, like a lot of the new shows are by about female heroes. Naomi's a new show that's going to start on the CW soon. Far Sector, they brought DC had N.K. Jemisin, who writes, great sci-fi, to come in and do a Green Lantern series with this new Green Lantern character, um, a new Daredevil character, female Daredevil character. It's Elektra becomes Daredevil. So there's a lot. I mean, a lot has happened since. So we have the long history after 1955 of just the absence of these characters and moments of hope. But after 2012, there was just such a major push. Um, and so you go from, here's an image of the old Miss Marvel. Here you have her in her full body costume. I mean, this is 2005, this is 2012. I mean, you can just see the difference already in the art, like just how much has changed in the last 20 years, last 15 years. And so I think, I'm hopeful for what the future has in store. And I'll just end with this, with Miss Marvel doing the Rosie the Riveter. Kelly Sue DeConnick asked in 2012, show me that a female-led book about the power of the human spirit, about the many guises of heroism, a book where no one gets raped or puts her cervix on display can break 6 issues, won't you? This was a question like, can we get a female superhero that leads her own book that has more than 6 issues? As I was saying many times, like as I noted, the issue numbers, they don't last very long. Kelly Sue DeConnick came in, revamped Captain Marvel, and really created a renaissance for the female hero, for the female superhero.